Thank you very much, Manuel. At the outset, I'd like again to express my gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and the James Martin Center on Non-Proliferation, as well as OPANAL for this kind invitation to be with you in the summer school. I would like to share my screen if I'm allowed to do so. Just to, I hope you can, my screen is shared, right?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Okay, well, I will pass by how the regime of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament has been developed at international level. Obviously, the starting point in the modern era is 1945, Japan suffering of the detonation of nuclear weapons in Japan. The bombs had an effect on the people, of course, and the gods, and consequences on cultural property and the environment. This is now linked to the modern agenda, but actually it's a huge damage on both aspects of detonations. Well, I think there is some extra noise. So,
may I ask that everyone please turn your microphones off, except
should I?
Sorry, I think whoever's controlling the session may turn off the mics of the participants.
All right. Okay. Well, back again in the detonations in 1945. Well, the international community recognized then the importance of the non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, given the tremendous effects of those detonations. Well, international repercussions went the following years to establish, first of all, the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1957, oriented to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. That was the main purpose at the time. And during the following years, a more complex architecture was established by countries committed to non-proliferation and disarmament, the so-called Cold War era. I have to say that in some documents there are arguments related to the negotiations in the San Francisco during the negotiations of the UN Charter. And some countries recognized that if they had known of the power of the atomic bombs dropped by the US army, they wouldn't sign the charter. I invite you to look around those arguments on different countries. One of them is one of the main powers still nowadays. So how the non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament architecture was established. Well, I think after the agency that I just mentioned, one of the most important treaties is the Tlatelolco Treaty, the Latin America and the Caribbean Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, which was adopted in 1967 after a number of years of discussions between the international community. It was an effort led by countries like Mexico, but and other countries of Latin America. I have to say that Brazil was also in front of the negotiations, but in the end was Mexico that finalized the terms of the treaty, and that's the reason why it's recognized by one of the top diplomats of the Mexican Foreign Service. And then the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, was adopted in 1968. We will see a little bit later what is this about this treaty and what is the challenges that are facing nowadays. In 1996, the next big step was the adoption of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which had a precedent in 1963 of a nuclear test ban treaty signed by the big powers, the US, the UK, and the Soviet Union in 1963. Then in 1996, it was a universal, so-called universal treaty under the umbrella of the United Nations. In the latest development on this topic is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, in 2017. But of course, there are a number of institutions and a number of fora that have been over these years discussing on these topics, in particular the Disarmament Commission in Geneva, who has follow the agenda over the years. Well, I'm going to stop for a little bit in the Treaty of Tlatelolco, signed as we all know in 1967. This was the first treaty that seeks international disarmament, nuclear-free zones, and the use of nuclear investigations for the benefit of the humanity. It has 2 additional protocols. It established the international regional organization that is or has a mandate to watch the appropriate implementation of the treaty, the OPANAL, one of the sponsors of this summer school. And after the Tlatelolco Treaty was adopted, 5 more treaties of nuclear-free zones were established in the world. So this treaty has some additional impact, not only to guarantee as Latin America and the Caribbean as a nuclear-free zone, but also impact influencing other regions of the world to adopt similar terms. And we have done the Treaty of Rarotonga for the South Pacific, the Treaty of Bangkok and the Southeast Asian region, the Treaty of Pelindaba for the region of the continent of Africa, the Treaty of Central Asia that explains for itself. And in 1992, we have a national declaration on Mongolia as a non-nuclear weapon status. So it was very important as well, given the fact and the location of Mongolia between China, Russia, in that part of the world. Well, the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, it entered into force in 1970. It focuses on the creation, transfer, and acquisition of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. It stipulates the commitment of each part to generate agreements for nuclear disarmament, and it also recognizes the existence of the Pacific nuclear explosions. The conference of this treaty is every 5 years, and I'm sure that during this summer school you will know better what are the challenges that this regime is facing during between 1970 and nowadays. We have, as we mentioned in one of the previous images, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It was adopted in the margins of by the UNGA, the UN General Assembly, in 1996. When this treaty will enter into force, because it has not entered into force yet, it will have the power to impede the development of new nuclear weapons. The treaty aims for the complete ban of nuclear testing by everyone and everywhere in the world. So it's a very good treaty with a complete scope of application. But nowadays it's signed by 185 states and ratified by 170. It's not yet in force because, given the provisions of Article 14, if I'm not mistaken, it needs a number of countries mentioned in the Annex 2 of the treaty, which is countries with capabilities to develop nuclear energy. And then we have China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and the US as countries that haven't ratified this treaty. They have signed the treaty, but they haven't ratified it. Plus India, North Korea, and Pakistan, which are not even signatory states of this treaty. So the CTBT is a great development by the time in 1996, given the scope that it has and the provisions of the treaty when it comes to the provision of development of new nuclear technology applied to weapons, but it still need to be ratified by a number of countries to enter into force, which looks very challenging nowadays. I would like to talk a little bit about the participation of Mexico in non-proliferation and the prohibition of nuclear weapons. My country has been a proactive partner in the UN since the beginning of the UN. Mexico has a voice against the use of the force in international relations in general. And it's louder when it comes to the development of nuclear weapons. So in recent years has been a proactive partner in the General Assembly for the adoption of the resolution 6756. This resolution has a value because established an open-ended working group of multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations in a time when the discussions in the first committee at the United Nations and in Geneva were kind of locked up. No one wanted to think more in developing legal regimes or strengthen the current legal aspects for deterring the countries to develop more weapons in this nuclear career. Well, Mexico, with a number of partners, adopt this resolution by the GA, and after that, there started the process of the different conferences to consider the humanitarian impact of the detonations and the nuclear weapons. One of the conference was hosted by Mexico in the city of Nayarit, in the state of Nayarit in 2014. And this particular conference was very important because it triggers the negotiations at the General Assembly. Was friends with civil society, with representative of states, but all the people and the legal community and the non-proliferation community was there, and make some important statements related to the development of a new treaty for the complete prohibition of the nuclear weapons. Mexico was one of the first countries then to ratify the TPNW, and it has been an active promoter of this regime. And at the very end of the 20th century, some countries request the GA to request the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the legality or not of the use of nuclear weapons. The Hungary requested this advisory opinion in 1995 to clarify specifically the legality of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons versus what many countries argue was the threat for the right to life, as it is included or prevailed in the ICCPR, so human rights treaty. The ICJ's advisory opinion in 1996 concludes that and the use of nuclear weapons are contrary to the paragraph 4 of the Article 2 of the UN Charter, the use of force in international relations. Of course, that was a very easy one for the court, but then enter into more difficult terrain when they state that the use of nuclear weapons goes against the applicable rules at armed conflicts and to the principles and rules of humanitarian law. I mean, I'm sure that my colleague from the ICRC can elaborate if you think it's important on this part. But also the court concludes that there is no conclusion of the legality or illegality. So this is very tricky for the language of the ICJ. No conclusion on the legality or illegality of the use of nuclear weapons. So the court leaves the doors open when it comes to self-defense scenario under the provisions of Article 51 of the UN Charter. Self-defense by state or by a group of states, as you know, the scope of Article 51. And also concludes that state parties to the NPT should conclude negotiations about nuclear disarmament, which is actually one of the main articles of the NPT, the calling for nuclear disarmament negotiations. Well, the most recent development of this field at the international law is the treaty on the provision of nuclear weapons, commonly known as the TPNW. It entered into force last January, on the 22nd of January. It has today 86 signatory states, which is a good number, 84 state parties, and includes a comprehensive set of prohibitions on participating in any nuclear weapons activities. This is a total prohibition: not develop, not test, not use, not acquire, not possess, and not use the threat or use, not the threat and the use of nuclear weapons globally. So it is in a complete prohibition, and in the positive side of the treaty, it encouraged the nuclear disarmament. The treaty seeks the mitigation of humanitarian and environmental effects caused by the nuclear weapons. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning in Japan, the environmental effects, and also the cultural loss of cultural property, the history of the country, when in that case was a country where the detonation was in 1945. This TPNW has a cooperation and assistance system between the objectives. Okay, we have 54 states parties. The TPNW has entered into force, but what happened? The treaty, during the negotiations, it was a lot of pressure from the big powers, of course, and the members of the military alliances, namely the NATO states, that they not only not participate in the negotiations, they reject the participation, but they start to lobby with those countries that were willing to negotiate this treaty in the margins of the General Assembly, trying to impede that they participate in negotiations. It was a lot of political pressure. I can tell you that a lot of political pressure from the big powers for not advancing the negotiations on this treaty. We have on the other side a lot of support from civil society, and civil society from developing and developed countries. So it was not a scenario where developing versus developed countries were working around the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and this is part of the international campaign that is going on now on the ICAN and the association, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons Report, ICAN. They are focusing their efforts now in the NATO countries And they have released a report very recently, and they are proposing that to take steps to become a non-nuclear states, the countries of the NATO, the alliance, for different reasons, because they know that they have a widespread support for the TPNW within many NATO states, including the public opinion polls, the parliamentary resolutions, political party declarations from many countries in Europe, and the support of the mayors of important cities like London, for instance. So it is increasingly gaining support from public opinion and civil society. And I think the states parties of this treaty can support those efforts, advocating for the ratification of the treaty and looking to consolidate the regime, because at the end, the aim is to consolidate the efforts of the treaties on nuclear disarmament. I think with this slot, I can finish my presentation. In my final remark, I want to invite you as a diplomat, young diplomats and students of international affairs and international law to look into this treaty, the TPNW, because it has the potential to become a very important tool against the nuclear powers. I don't think that nuclear disarmament the international community will reach it soon, but with no doubt, this treaty is a very powerful tool for the political negotiations to raise the bar against the public opinion in developing countries that are against the nuclear weapons or the weapons or the threat of the use of nuclear weapons in international relations. So with a very complicated scenario at international level, the global agenda, it's very complicated nowadays. Not to mention the risks and the challenges posed by the COVID-19. It is important to continue working with partners, with the civil society organization and with the international organizations to improve our standards against the nuclear, the nuclear activities worldwide. Thank you very much again, and I will be glad to answer some of the questions that you have. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Let me try and share my screen. If I find my PowerPoint, there it is. So, as you said, I will say a few words on the ICRC's perspective on the TPNW and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as on what international humanitarian law has to say about nuclear weapons. So a few words just to frame our discussion first, maybe on the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the entire movement of Red Cross and Red Crescent societies with regard to nuclear disarmament. It started obviously with the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the ICRC delegates were present and witnessed the catastrophic effects of the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and the devastation that it caused, and the inability really of first responders and of doctors and nurses to cope with the magnitude of injuries and suffering that civilians witnessed there. So very shortly after that, already in September 1945, the ICRC called for the abolishing of nuclear weapons. And the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement over the next decades following that has consistently been calling for the absolute prohibition of nuclear weapons. In 2010, and I note this as a pivotal moment, and you will see in a bit why, the president of the ICRC appealed to states to view nuclear weapons through the lens of humanity and of international humanitarian law. This was an important moment because up until then, the nuclear debate was mainly dominated by discourse around politics, geostrategic issues, and regional and international dynamics. And nuclear weapons were being viewed as a tool for international stability and as a lawful means for national self-defense and as a tool for maintaining dynamics as they were in international relations. And what the ICRC called for was a shift in this debate. So instead of focusing on those aspects of nuclear deterrence and geostrategic and political aspects, focusing on the humanitarian consequences of the weapon and on the illegality, generally speaking, of the weapon under international law. And this shift was also marked in 2010, 1 month after the ICRC President's appeal, where the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, by consensus, for the first time expressed deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and reaffirmed the need for all states to comply with international humanitarian law, including when they use nuclear weapons. So this really triggered an avalanche of initiatives that Mr. Alday already mentioned, the 3 humanitarian impact conferences in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna, and then the humanitarian initiative, the open-ended working group, and ultimately the negotiation and adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. Just to finish up with the role of the ICRC and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, national societies, so Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, have been working with the ICRC on promoting nuclear disarmament, raising awareness of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear detonations. And this work is also formalized in an action plan that we have been working on consecutively since 2013. So it is one of the big priorities for the ICRC. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I won't go into the details of the provisions because you will address these in more detail later on in your program. I will just mention some key points that are key from the ICRC's perspective that we see as important in this treaty. It was for us, and I think for many states and civil society, a historic development. It's the first international instrument to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons. Some of the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties do prohibit the use of nuclear weapons, others don't. The TPNW is the first treaty that is potentially of universal applicability. Of course, it binds only the states that are party to it, like every treaty, but it is a global treaty. And it prohibits a whole series of activities that you will see in more detail later on around nuclear weapons, including the use and the possession and the development of nuclear weapons. The treaty is very much based on principles and rules of international humanitarian law, and it is aimed at preventing and mitigating the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons. Preventing because it prohibits, of course, possession, use, development, etc., but also mitigating because it imposes upon states parties obligations with regard to assisting victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons and decontaminating the natural environment that has been contaminated by the use or the testing of those weapons. And it is, at least in our view and in the view of many states, this treaty is an effective measure in implementing the Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which obliges states parties to pursue negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. It provides pathways for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, even though the treaty itself does not eliminate nuclear weapons, but at least for the ICRC, as history of weapons regulation has shown, prohibiting a weapon is the first step to eliminating the weapon. We have seen this with chemical weapons and with biological weapons, to name just a few. When we talk about non-proliferation, the TPNW is not a non-proliferation instrument. However, for the ICRC, the prohibition of nuclear weapons is a disincentive to their proliferation, or rather, if you see it the other way around, the continued possession of nuclear weapons can very well serve as an incentive for their proliferation. For the ICRC, the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons is a humanitarian imperative because of the catastrophic consequences that they have on people, individuals, but also entire communities, on the environment, on future generations, on the climate, on food production, on socio-economic development, consequences that cannot be controlled and that spread in time, as we see today when generations following the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings still fall ill and die of cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. Any use of nuclear weapons would, moreover, involve a risk of escalation. So even the use of a small tactical, so-called tactical nuclear weapon with unpredictable catastrophic consequences. These consequences have been documented by many organizations, including the ICRC, and I would bring your attention here to the report of a workshop that the ICRC hosted last year on research and findings on the humanitarian impacts and the risks of use of nuclear weapons. I will send the link to this report in the chat box. It's available on the ICRC website. It's a very short report, and I really encourage you to read it because it summarizes the knowns and unknowns. So what we know in terms of the consequences and the risks, but also what gaps exist in our knowledge and why there is need for more data and more research and evidence around those aspects. It has also been submitted as a working paper to the NPT review conference that will take place next year. Mr. Alday already mentioned there is a broader nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture, different instruments, the Test Ban Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Weapon Free Zones treaties, and the TPNW is part of this broader system. So the TPNW is not the end of our efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. There is still a long way to go, but it is definitely a critical step in that direction. You will look into both the TPNW and the NPT in more detail later on. So I will just say at this stage that the ICRC views these two instruments as complementary and mutually reinforcing. And I say this because you will see that there have been arguments by some states that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons undermines the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In reality, and at least this is our view, the TPNW advances the object and purpose of the NPT and imposes some additional prohibitions, of course. It prohibits the use and the hosting of nuclear weapons, principally, which the Non-Proliferation Treaty does not do per se. And there is still a remaining obligation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty for states to pursue negotiations to achieve the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, which, as I said, is not something that the TPNW does. It does not eliminate nuclear weapons, it prohibits them, and it paves the way towards nuclear disarmament. A few words on nuclear risk reduction. It's a humanitarian imperative for the ICRC, for states to urgently take effective measures to reduce the risk of use of nuclear weapons, whether deliberate or accidental or unintentional. The risk of use has risen in recent years because of a variety of factors. Tensions between nuclear possessor states and their allies, bringing them often to the brink of conflict. Development of new types of nuclear weapons that are smaller and more usable, so they're easier and quicker to use. The vulnerability to cyber attacks as new technologies develop and the cyber domain becomes more and more active and accessible. These command and control systems of nuclear weapons become vulnerable, of course, to cyber attacks with a nightmare scenario that they will be hacked, leading to their deliberate or otherwise use. There is no legal obligation for states to reduce nuclear risks, but there are multiple political commitments that they have taken by means of UN General Assembly resolutions, but also in the famous 2010 action plan that was adopted by the states party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where they committed to taking a long series of actions towards nuclear disarmament, including measures to reduce the risk of a nuclear weapon use, like unilateral declarations that they will not use nuclear weapons first. China is the only nuclear weapon state currently to have made such a no first use policy public. De-alerting is removing nuclear weapons from high alert status, where they can be used immediately or very quickly, and reducing their role in defense and security policies. And this is an area, risk reduction is an area where for the ICRC, it will be critical that states party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty agree on making tangible progress in the next review conference. A few words on the law, and I promise not to go into a lot of legal details. So for those who are not familiar with international humanitarian law, it is the branch of law that regulates conduct in war, basically in armed conflict, and there are rules that regulate how hostilities are fought. You have the key rules on the screen: distinction between combatants and civilians, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks. These are attacks that are not directed against a combatant or a military objective. Proportionality, where the civilian harm caused by the attack must be proportionate to the military advantage to be won by the attack. Prohibition of using weapons that cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This is suffering that goes beyond what is necessary to achieve the military purpose, that is excessive suffering. And there are rules also in IHL that protect the natural environment against the effects of hostilities. Now, the ICJ already in the 1996 advisory opinion that was already mentioned, pronounced on the legality of nuclear weapons. So it said that IHL, international humanitarian law, applies to the use of nuclear weapons, and that their use would generally be contrary to the principles and rules of IHL, and it seems scarcely reconcilable with respect for the rules of IHL. Now, the ICRC's position is a bit stronger than not surprisingly, than the International Court's position, and in our view, it is extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with the principles and rules of IHL. This is the baseline, and it refers to all scenarios of use, wherever they are used, whether it is a big nuclear bomb or a small, low-yield tactical nuclear weapon. We find that it is extremely doubtful that they can never be used in a way that respects the key rules of IHL that I just mentioned. Just one point first, because Mr. Alday mentioned the ICJ's lack of conclusion as to whether nuclear weapons would be legal or illegal in extreme situations of national self-defense. In the ICRC's view, international humanitarian law applies to all situations in an armed conflict, including national self-defense, which means that it would also be extremely doubtful that the use of nuclear weapons, even in national self-defense, would be lawful under the law of war. There are two scenarios where for the ICRC, it's clear that the use of nuclear weapons would violate the law. One is obviously when they're used against civilians or civilian objects like entire cities. And this may seem self-evident, but in reality, most nuclear weapon doctrines of the states that possess nuclear weapons were premised upon scenarios whereby these weapons would be used against big strategic centers and big cities of the enemy in order to finish off the war. So in reality, it's legally speaking self-evident, but in fact, it's terrifying to think that nuclear deterrence is indeed premised upon the threat of use of nuclear weapons, not in the desert somewhere, but against cities where it would really hurt the adversary. Using nuclear weapons against objectives located in populated areas or near populated areas would also violate the prohibitions of indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks because of the large effects of nuclear weapons and the radiation which spreads uncontrollably and is not possible to limit it onto the target. And of course, in populated areas where there is civilians and civilian objects, the use of a nuclear weapon would have indiscriminate effects on those civilians and therefore clearly violated. Sometimes we hear of a scenario where the use a nuclear weapon, a small nuclear weapon, would be used somewhere far away, like on the high seas or in the desert against soldiers, and that this use would not be unlawful. For the ICRC, still, it would be extremely doubtful that even in such scenarios, the use of nuclear weapons would be lawful under IHL if we consider the type of injury and disease that radiation causes, even on soldiers, which would violate probably the prohibition of superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering that I mentioned, and also the fact that radiation seeps into the water and then the fish or the earth, and then obviously the agricultural production, or is carried away by the winds, very likely reaching civilian areas, and therefore raises very big questions with regard to indiscriminate and disproportionate effects. Not to mention that such a use of nuclear weapons in a remote area remains a highly unrealistic scenario, as I mentioned, based on nuclear deterrence and the premise of that theory. The threat of use of nuclear weapons, obviously, it's prohibited by the TPNW, and in the ICRC's view, any threat to use nuclear weapons would be contrary to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. And this is also very close to what the International Court of Justice said. It said that if a use of weapon would be unlawful, then the threat to use would also be unlawful, which makes perfect sense. Nuclear deterrence is based on the theory of mutually assured destruction. As you know, we possess nuclear weapons to deter others from attacking us, but then the threat needs to be credible in order for deterrence to serve its purpose. Therefore, the nuclear weapon should be powerful enough, and the scenario of use would pose a credible threat, hence planned use against big cities. For the ICRC, it's clear that such theories of security that rely on the threat of mass suffering and destruction would be contrary to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. And I will close with what ICRC President Peter Maurer said in 2018. Nuclear weapons would have catastrophic and long-lasting humanitarian consequences, and they cannot credibly be viewed as instruments of security. Most states today see nuclear weapons as a major source of insecurity for their populations and for future generations. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and back to you, Manuel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giorgou, for this insightful presentation. I think you raised important issues in your presentations that will be really helpful for our next sessions. The relevance of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences, the reasons why nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with the principles and rules of international humanitarian law. And also you mentioned that the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the TPNW are complementary and reinforce each other. I think this idea could be really useful for our participants for our next sessions on Thursday and Friday. Now I will open the floor for questions from participants. If you have any question, please raise your hand and we will give you the floor. Please, Enrique, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for the presentations. They were very insightful. So yesterday I asked about the TPNW and how it covers some sort of help to people and environments impacted by nuclear testing. Of course, I appreciate the answer yesterday of Mr. Duprez. So I went to dig a little deeper on the TPNW. And as I understand, the treaty obliges member states to provide assistance to individuals and environments affected by the use of nuclear testing in areas under each state's jurisdiction. So I find this a bit problematic. I don't know if I might be wrong, but what happens with the nuclear tests that were done outside each state's jurisdiction? I mean, because the responsibility according to the treaty relies on the state within the jurisdiction. For instance, the United States tested a lot of nuclear weapons back in the 50s in what is now the Marshall Islands. So in these cases, is the responsibility of addressing these effects of the Marshall Islands because it is within the jurisdiction of the Marshall Islands, or is it the United States' responsibility because at the end of the day, they carried out the test? Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique, for your question. We will collect a couple more. We have Anna also. Please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really appreciate this presentation. Something that I think took me a while to understand when I first started hearing about the TPNW was the strong legal basis of the international humanitarian law that is supporting the need for this treaty. And something that it's now hard for me to understand, and what are the counter arguments that countries that are against TPNW use regarding the humanitarian law? Because I think it's a very strong case, legally speaking. How did they react to this? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now, Elena, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question on terminology. I do not have a background in law, I'm not a lawyer, but in the Treaty of Tlatelolco, there's a very clear definition of what nuclear weapons are. And I wanted to ask whether you believe there's any kind of impact and speak a little bit on what that impact might be on not having a specific definition of nuclear weapons in the TPNW. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Now, I don't know which of our panelists would like to take the floor and answer some of the questions.
Sure, I can start.
Go ahead.
Eirini, go ahead, please.
No, you were first.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to take up the Enrique's question related to the potential testing in the Marshall Island territory carried out by the US or other country. I think it will depend, obviously, on the terms of the agreement between two countries for making the test, because there is no an isolation in here. If the US military or other military will going to make some tests in the Marshall Islands area, they have to agree on to do so, because they are using their territorial sovereign the sovereign state of Marshall Island has to grant the license or permits to make some testing, and the impacts and the effects, I think they have to be carried out by the country that has been testing the nuclear weapons, in this case the US, but it's difficult to know at some point what are the details of such agreements. But there is no way that a big power make testings without at least the previous information and probably an agreement with other states for conducting this. Eirini.
Yeah, thanks a lot. On this question, so there's a couple of points. First, generally speaking, treaties can only impose obligations on state parties. So as long as the US is not party to the TPNW, the treaty cannot bind the US. Second, the fact that the TPNW does not have a provision saying that whoever tested pays does not mean that there is no responsibility under international law for those who conducted tests, but under other rules of international law, not the TPNW. Environmental law, human rights law, violation of national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and that's where we go to what Alejandro said. Usually there was an agreement. Those tests were not unilaterally conducted like this, but still, in many cases, there are bilateral agreements in place for compensation for the contamination of the environment and for victim assistance. So the fact that the treaty did not impose directly an obligation on those states, because none of the states who conducted tests are party to the TPNW, right? First, it was legally not possible, and second, does not exclude their responsibility under international law, but it was it's a legitimate question because it was one that was very heavily negotiated in the negotiations on the treaty. Shall I take, Manuel, shall I take the other two, or?
Sure, and I can take final one if you like it.
Okay, so I'll take the one on the counter arguments on IHL illegality. Again, a couple of points. The main counter argument is that what I mentioned, the scenario of use of small nuclear weapon in remote areas, so on the high sea or in the desert against a military objective, and that this would not violate IHL because it would not violate distinction and proportionality. Then again, if we dig deeper and based on what we know on the consequences of nuclear weapons for the ICRC, even there it is doubtful that use would be lawful. And then some states have persistently publicly been saying that nuclear weapons are not, the prohibition of nuclear weapons is not customary international law, because we have treaty law and custom. Custom binds states whether they are party to a treaty or not. The fact that a state rejects a customary norm persistently means that it is not bound by it. So the nuclear weapon states, or many of them, have been persistently saying they don't consider the prohibition of nuclear weapons to be customary law. So they have that legalistic argument as well. It's how international law works. And they also made reservations when additional protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions was adopted on the rules, for example, protecting the natural environment. Some nuclear weapon states made a reservation saying that we don't agree that this rule applies to nuclear weapons. So there is a couple of arguments that they have that in our view don't change our conclusion. Because as you said, we also believe that it is basically impossible to imagine a scenario where a nuclear weapon could be used in a way that respects all rules of IHL.
Thank you, Dr. Giorgou.
And
Yeah, please, Mr. Alday, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I got the question of Elena Curcio related to the TPNW does not include a definition of what is a nuclear weapon, because it is related to the complete ban of the use of nuclear weapons. And there are different definitions, but I think the most common recognized at the international level is those weapons based on the nuclear energy that can cause an explosion. That's a traditional one. And well, obviously we can talk about the new set of nuclear weapons that are linked to the cyber development or the automatic weapons carrying the nuclear head. The beauty of this treaty is that prohibits every single activity related to the nuclear weapons, from the production, stock, use, trade, etc., etc., etc. And one additional point that I want to make that is an advancement in if you compare it with what the International Court of Justice said in 1996, is that this treaty, the TPNW, recognizes that the use of nuclear weapons are contrary to the international law and the principles of IHL as it was just explained. So the state parties of this treaty are recognizing that in case of using nuclear weapons in any of the forms that are referred to in the treaty, they are acting against the international law, and they are obliged by the state responsibility against another state or against the international community. It will depend on the use of the nuclear weapon. I hope that is a sort of a response to your question.
Thank you, Mr. Alday. And now I'll give the floor to Jean Dupré, who will make some complementary remarks.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about in response to the question about the responsibility of states to clean up testing the consequences of nuclear testing. There was a question about a particular reference to the Marshall Islands, and I think it's important here. I think my understanding of that question was not related to the resumption of testing in the Marshall Islands, which the Marshall Islands is an independent country, and it's part also of a nuclear weapon-free zone. But I think it's more to do with the responsibility under international law of the United States to clean up the contamination in that area. And we will be talking about the CTBT next week, and depending on the time available, I may or may not be able to share detail. But let me just make a few comments. One, the Marshall Islands, while the United States started to clean up the contamination in the 70s, it was not done satisfactorily, and in fact, the site is leaking at the moment. But the Marshall Islands went to the International Court, and there was a Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal that recognized the population's right to receive compensation for the harm inflicted by the test. And in fact, the US in 2019, if I remember correctly, admitted that it actually withheld information about the extent of nuclear waste left there. Negotiations have been ongoing between the US and the Marshall Islands. It was stalled during the Trump administration, and we will see where this is going. But I think this is a clear example of that, in terms of international law, that there was a recognition that the United States has a legal obligation to clean up some of the contamination. Similarly, Russia should be held accountable for the mess that it left in Kazakhstan. Of course, the Russians argue that was the Soviet Union, and so it has technically takes no responsibility for it. But this is a really it's a very good question about the and this, I think Eirini mentioned this, is that the TPNW actually covers areas of international law related to non-proliferation, which other treaties do not, such as the CTBT or the NPT or whatnot. So it's certainly a useful aspect to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think we have the time for a last question from Jose David from the mission of Costa Rica to the UN.
Thank you, Manuel. Very nice of you. Very nice to see you again after such a long time. And I wanted to go back a little bit on the political strategy on the TPNW. If we have assumed that the civil society did play a very important role in this treaty, in the implementation and the negotiation process, in the providing scientific data to the state parties to negotiate, I wonder if you see that this same amount of feedback or input or even pressure or support, as you may want to see it, could also be deployed into lobbying within the nuclear countries' Congress, in those that are, that there is a possibility on that. So in comparison to push the treaty, for example, I understand, as far as I see it, rather, we do need to have international treaties, as we were commenting before, the international law, the treaty law, it is important. However, how do you see, and that would be my question, if that lobby, if that push could also be deployed within the lobby of those countries that actually possess nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Thank you, David. I don't know who would like to address this question.
Yeah.
Mr. Alday, yeah, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jose, for this question. I think everything at hand will be useful. Of course, the scientific information will be part of the package of information for the lobby in every single country. When we talk about the developed country, those who have nuclear weapons or are hosts of nuclear weapons, I think it is also a matter of morality, because they are the promoters of democracy, of human rights, the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So it is important for the public opinion to know better about the risks that the government of such a country is putting them on, being part of alliances or being a nuclear state, given the risk of a nuclear detonation or nuclear testing. You have to see that after the Cold War era, all the international agenda just switched, giving more importance to the individuals, to the people, than to the states. And thus we have developments in human rights, humanitarian law, and all the agenda related to individuals, women, children, indigenous people, etc., etc. So that is part of the main argument when it comes to the effects on the human rights before a detonation of nuclear weapons. So I think it's a very good basis to continue the lobbying. We have seen in the past weeks manifestation from Parliament and the mayors of important cities in Europe against the nuclear activities of their country. So that is the base of public opinion. Some people in government that can be part of this force again for those countries to be part of this new regime. And scientific diplomacy is also important in this particular case.
Thank you, Mr. Alday. I don't know if Dr. Giorgou would like to make some complimentary remarks. No, thank you. So thank you again to our panelists for their time, their excellent presentations, and for contributing to the Summer School on Nuclear and Disarmament. Having said that, I hand it over to Paola and John to close the session.